Good morning, and thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a practitioner myself from local government. I'm going to talk about engagement a little bit. I'm a new member of the faculty at the Humphrey School, and I teach public engagement to people who are preparing for careers in public and nonprofit management. And I'm going to start actually by asking to draw upon the wisdom in the room. Generally, when I organize engagement myself as a practitioner and in my own classroom, I really like to draw out the expertise that's here. We're not going to have an opportunity to discuss this in a dialogue just now, but I'm going to ask you to sit for a few minutes and just jot down a few notes about an engagement experience that you have been involved in. It could be one that you have hosted or organized, or one that you've participated in recently that was outstanding to you in some way. It could be outstanding as in, I hope that never happens again, or wow, that really worked really well. And part of what I'm trying to do is to set us up for some of the table discussions that follow these brief framing up comments that I'm going to make, but also just to sort of honor the fact that engagement really is about what people bring to the table, right? So let me just give you a few minutes, and with having prompted you to talk about what was outstanding, here are a few questions that may help you get your juices flowing too. So let's just spend maybe 3 or 4 minutes jotting down a few notes. Ed made, I think, a really astute comment earlier that sometimes we don't know what we mean by engagement. Sometimes we don't necessarily know even what that community is that we're trying to engage with. And that can complicate the work that we're trying to do. But there are a number of features, I think, of engagement right now. I would say that in general, the paradigm of engagement is generally about participation as input. By which I mean that very frequently what we're trying to do when we engage with the public is to get their input on some policy ideas or some programs that we're designing. And there are some other options, of course, for approaching engagement, right? Some of which some of you are probably experimenting with and are probably well involved in, including things like co-production of a definition of the problem to begin with, thinking through what kinds of process it is that you want to use for your decision-making process, not just sort of providing something for people to comment upon as a proposal or a project that you've used your expertise to develop, and now you want them to help sort of fine-tune around the edges. That is a very effective form of engagement, but there are certainly a lot of other possibilities as well. I would say that in general, there's also an experience that participation and engagement, when it's done well, takes an enormous amount of resources, right? It takes lots of commitment of time, expertise, political will, and all other kinds of resources that are required. And very often that feels like it requires more than the feedback that we get. So part of the questions I want to ask today are about how we might design engagement in ways that in fact get some more payoff for the work that we put into that. Frequently, I think it's also not very satisfying to agencies and the public, and I would argue that that's frequently because we have differing expectations of what we'll find when we get to the table. So there are lots of legitimacy claims about whether participation was done well, whether the engagement was meaningful, whether it was impactful, and a lot of that really has to do, I think, with communicating a particular message to one another about what it is that we could reasonably expect when we enter into an engagement setting. And I have a handout for you that, if you're not familiar with it, may help you to sort through some of that. In addition, engagement is rarely evaluated across all sectors, right? And I would make the argument that it's really helpful to do designing and accomplishing better engagement if at the very beginning we think about what are those outcomes that we're trying to accomplish and think about some evaluation measures. Even if they are things that are difficult to evaluate and to measure explicitly, it's really helpful to get those things on the table. So I'm going to conclude today with suggestions about some things that you might think about in terms of evaluation. I would also guess that among the people in the room, you probably named a number of challenges that are very commonly found. You probably know this, but I just want to be sure that you know that you're in really good company with those challenges. Okay, there's a lot of issues around public trust and legitimacy in a process. If people are invited into participating, do they have a sense of that is worth their time, that's really going to go somewhere? There's sort of a general level of holding people a little bit at arm's length about whether that's worth their time. There's also this issue that you probably struggle with around the technical complexity of your issues. You are here because of a particular area of content expertise that the public or other people with whom you engage may not share. And so it's difficult to negotiate sometimes around what it is that you need to do to bring them up to speed in order to have an informed discussion, while also honoring the perspectives and the ways of knowing that they bring to the table. And that can be some challenging work, but it can be done very well. Also, bringing a diverse range of participants to the table is consistently a challenge. right, in terms of diversity along any kind of dimension that we might think of. I just named this issue of diversity along the dimension of different ways of understanding a problem, but certainly there's socioeconomic diversity, there's geographic diversity, there are all kinds of things we deal with. In addition, I think that the public sometimes doesn't understand the real constraints on decision making that we have. For example, there may be only so many parts of a decision that really are moving parts because of legislative constraints or resource constraints, or perhaps some, engineering specifications that really can't be fiddled with. And parsing those things out for the people with whom we engage can definitely be helpful in making it more meaningful. So I want to suggest that there are sort of 4 key questions to think about in designing an engagement process, not only in designing a particular engagement process, but in entering into relationships between the university and Hennepin County and deepening those around engagement. I think there are sort of 4 key questions to ask. The first one is, what are the purposes of public engagement? The second is, can we move beyond the usual pattern of participation as just being input on problems? How do we manage the engagement? This is a question about sort of techniques and frameworks. And then the 4th one is the one that I lobbed up earlier, and I suggest that we think about really from the very beginning, which is how will we evaluate those outcomes. The question of what is the purpose of engagement may seem like a very trite one. But I would suggest from my own observation and research that we very frequently overlook this question and that it leads to a lot of conflict and sometimes a certain amount of wasted effort, because we're not really clear and explicit about what those purposes are. People come into the room with different expectations, and sometimes we design that's in a way that's not really well suited to the purpose. If the purpose is that we just need to meet a legal mandate, that we are required to engage with our partners or the public in some way, then that really calls for a design that doesn't consume probably as many resources as something in which we're really trying to get a different kind of output. Sometimes we engage in democracy, we engage in participation and engagement because that's our idea of what democracy and engagement should be. This is how we create a democratic society. That calls for a different way of designing and engaging. Sometimes it's because we want to engage participants so that we can discover new ideas, so that we get a diversity of opinion in the room and we're able to discover new ways of understanding a problem. I would suggest that if engagement is being done well, it always involves learning. Even if we have a lot of expertise in an area and we're stepping up and having a conversation with people about it, if we feel like we're not learning ourselves, then probably that engagement is not working very well. There should be really something new and stimulating for everyone. Okay, and there are a number of other different kinds of purposes here, which I won't belabor right now, but I think probably a lot of them are familiar to you. And they call for different kinds of design strategies. I would also just ask the question in thinking about engagement. This is a handout that you should have found somewhere as you were coming in. That it really is worth thinking about whether we can move beyond participation as input into a different kind of engagement that really involves thinking about creating more long-term connections and capacities. So I would just push on those who are thinking about participation basically as a way of weighing in on policies and fine-tuning them around the edges, to think about whether there aren't also ways to enter into these partnerships with people around the room and with other constituents to really think about whether we aren't able to build an adaptive capacity as well to deal with increasingly complex problems in which sometimes it's hard to get our hands around even what the problem is. It's an evolving problem, it's very complicated, there's no one party or one kind of expertise that can really address it, and that calls for an attention to relationship building in which we can kind of adaptively in an ongoing way continue to work through one problem after another. So I would just suggest this as a way of thinking about where you might place yourself in that whole space of thinking about what engagement is for. I'm sure that lots of you have different experiences with managing engagement efforts, and there are plenty of people who are familiar with a wide range of techniques and frameworks for managing engagement, lots of which are effective for different settings. If you're not familiar with it, who has already seen the IAP2 spectrum of participation? This is a really familiar tool that's used a lot in public agencies. And I just think it's very helpful because in thinking about engagement, one of the things that I really like about this spectrum is that it's a spectrum. It doesn't suggest that there's one right way of doing engagement, but I think it does help us to get pretty clear about where it is that we are. I wouldn't suggest that one problem area or even one particular venue or engagement effort falls into a single one of these silos, but I think it can be pretty clarifying sometimes to use this tool to say, this is part of what we're trying to accomplish. We are here today to involve you. We're here to work directly with you throughout a process in deciding what that problem is about, and you're going to have some influence on decisions. That's a different kind of thing to organize and a different kind of message to communicate if you move down to the second row than saying, we're really here to inform you about what it is that we're doing. We want you to understand what we're doing to the extent that we can. We'd like you to understand the purpose of that and the rationale behind it and the kind of reasoning that's gone into it and the thoughtfulness, but we're not really here at this point to ask you for your opinions and to ask you to change the decision, right? Those are different kinds of settings, and the communication strategy that's involved in those is obviously different. And Steve is going to be talking about communication as an aspect of engagement in just a couple of minutes. So I'd just like to highlight that as an aspect of our thinking about design. I would also say that I think that this third row here is a more dangerous zone when it comes to saying, okay, let's sort of follow down from the bottom to the top. These engagement techniques can be used in such a wide variety of ways with very different purposes that I don't think it's a super great idea to pull a technique off the shelf and just sort of slap it onto one of these columns without really thinking about the particular implications of how it can be done. And if you want to catch me afterwards, I have some great examples of how dot voting, with which I'm sure many of you are familiar, can be used in a wide range of purposes and cause a lot of conflict and problem because of the different expectations that people have about how that might be used. So that's just an illustration of how pulling something off the shelf in order to match the technique to this rubric is not always a great idea. And finally, I'm just going to conclude with saying that there are a number of ways to evaluate the effort depending upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish. I think it's helpful to look at both individual to community level outcomes in terms of what it is that you're trying to accomplish. You may want to focus on some process-oriented outcomes, like how well did we do with engaging diverse stakeholders? What could we learn about this? What might we do better? Surely also you're going to want to evaluate content-related outcomes. I think sometimes when we think about public engagement, we really do become focused on sort of the democracy-building aspect of the work. And it's also, of course, very important to think about, well, what real implications has this had in terms of the quality of public policy outcomes? And as experts, you certainly have some opinions about that, and there are ways to work that into the process. Certainly also it's useful to measure users' understanding of the process and whether they're satisfied with it. And finally, I think that engagement is not a one-off kind of a thing. It's really an ongoing process, and so it's helpful to also build in some evaluation measures that have to do with not only how did today go, but what kinds of things have come out of that on an ongoing basis. So those are just some things that I've set out there to frame up the discussions today, and I thank you and appreciate the opportunity to come and meet you. Thanks.